did. The vast majority of Americans have never heard of the Columbia River Treaty. That in itself is the core of the problem. Did. A quiet but serious diplomatic standoff between the United States and Canada is currently threatening the electricity supply, food production, and economic stability of an entire region, and the issue is barely getting any coverage. By the time you finish reading this, you will understand why one river, one treaty, and one catastrophically misjudged negotiating decision could reshape power dynamics across North America for generations to come. And when the word power is used here, it means it in the most literal sense: electricity, the kind that keeps civilization running. Let us begin with something that will likely catch you off guard. The Columbia River is not simply a scenic backdrop in a nature film. It is the fourth largest river system on the entire continent, stretching roughly 2,000 kilometers through both Canada and the United States. 60 dams are distributed across this system. 60, collectively. Those structures generate nearly 40% of every unit of hydroelectric power produced across the entire United States. Not just one region, the whole country. Think carefully about what that number truly represents. Every time a manufacturing plant in Oregon powers up its assembly lines, every time a data center in Seattle handles millions of digital requests simultaneously, every time grain barges carry wheat toward Pacific export terminals. The Columbia River system is the silent engine underneath all of it, not as an afterthought, as the invisible backbone supporting a massive portion of the American economy. Approximately 42 million tons of goods move through this corridor annually. Almost 1 in every $10 of American wheat exports depends entirely on this river. The stakes here were never merely symbolic. They have always been economic, industrial, agricultural, and strategically vital all at once. And here is the element that makes this story even more remarkable. This entire cross-border infrastructure partnership between two of the world's most powerful economies exists because of a single catastrophe that unfolded nearly 8 decades ago. In May 1948, the Columbia River surged without warning. Within hours, the city of Vanport, Oregon, had effectively ceased to exist, not flooded, erased. More than 19,000 residents were left with nothing after floodwaters tore through neighborhoods so swiftly that many people could not evacuate before the water consumed everything in its path. It remains among the worst floods in American history. In the aftermath of that disaster, Washington grasped an uncomfortable truth. It did not matter how much dam infrastructure America constructed downstream if Canada held authority over the headwaters upstream. Engineering alone could not solve a geographic reality. Rivers do not acknowledge political borders, and they pay no attention to campaign speeches or election cycles. That flood drove both governments to the negotiating table. 16 years and several presidential administrations later, the Columbia River Treaty was formally signed in 1964. And Canada made sacrifices under that agreement that most people in Washington have long since forgotten. To create the reservoir systems behind the Mica, Duncan, and Keenleyside dams, Canada deliberately submerged roughly 110,000 hectares of its own territory, farmland, indigenous homelands, and entire communities, all flooded to build the storage infrastructure that would shield American cities and stabilize Pacific Northwest power generation for decades ahead. In exchange, the United States committed to what became known as the Canadian Entitlement, a long-term financial compensation arrangement worth hundreds of millions of dollars across the decades. The downstream advantages inside American territory were so substantial that Washington viewed this deal as essential to national economic stability. The arrangement worked. For decades, it functioned remarkably well. The United States received dependable flood control, stable hydroelectric output, and regulated river navigation. Canada received compensation for the enormous environmental and territorial costs of holding all that water upstream. The agreement endured through the Cold War, multiple recessions, several energy crises, and countless rounds of trade friction because leaders on both sides understood something that modern politics tends to overlook. Infrastructure partnerships built over 60 years cannot simply be dismantled overnight through pressure campaigns and political posturing. By 2024, however, both governments recognized that portions of the treaty required updating. Key flood management provisions were approaching expiration, while shifting climate patterns, worsening drought cycles, and rapidly accelerating electricity demand were forcing both nations to reconsider long-range water strategy. Negotiators from both sides spent years developing a modernized framework under the previous American administration. By most accounts, they had reached a general agreement in principle, one that would adapt treaty operations to contemporary conditions while preserving the foundational relationship both countries depended on. Then came the political transition, and the entire strategic calculation changed overnight. Rather than treating the treaty as the essential national asset it had always been, officials within the new administration reportedly began approaching it the way they might a disadvantageous trade deal, something where America was conceding too much. The Canadian entitlement became politically awkward in certain circles because on paper, it appeared as though the United States was compensating another country for benefits that many Americans assumed they were naturally entitled to by geography alone. That misreading turned out to be one of the most consequential errors in this entire saga, because the United States does not own the upstream, Canada does. That is not a political opinion. It is simply where the river originates. In early 2025, Washington suspended implementation of the modernized framework. The apparent reasoning was straightforward from a pressure standpoint. Tie river cooperation to broader trade concessions, apply tariff pressure on Canadian electricity exports as a bargaining chip, and inflict enough economic discomfort that Ottawa would accept weakened compensation terms or agree to stronger water flow guarantees. It appeared to be a standard negotiating move, except the strategy contained one catastrophic miscalculation. When the United States withdrew from the modernized agreement in July, the system did not simply vanish. It reverted to the original 1964 treaty structure. And that original structure preserved many of the exact Canadian advantages Washington had been attempting to reduce. That was the moment analysts began recognizing that something had gone seriously wrong inside the White House's strategic thinking. Canada did not surrender operational control over the upstream reservoirs. Canada did not relinquish its leverage over water storage timing. Canada did not lose the entitlement framework. What the United States lost was the only negotiated pathway that might have secured more predictable long-term cooperation under evolving climate conditions. Geography, once again, overruled politics because being downstream limits your options regardless of how large your economy may be. There is an old adage in water policy circles that suddenly sounded less like a metaphor and more like a strategic briefing document. It is always better to be upstream with a shovel than downstream with a legal argument. The implications extend far beyond electricity pricing. The Columbia Basin sustains vast irrigation networks supporting agricultural output across the entire Pacific Northwest. Replacing even a portion of its integrated infrastructure would demand decades of construction and potentially hundreds of billions of dollars in spending. Some estimates place the minimum cost of replacing just a segment of the river's combined benefits at $30 billion, a figure that climbs sharply once transmission networks, flood control systems, reservoir infrastructure, and 60 years of industrial dependencies built around predictable river flows are factored in. Even if Washington had unlimited capital available tomorrow, it could not reconstruct this system within any reasonable political timeline. Major hydroelectric projects routinely take decades from initial approval to operational completion. This is not a challenge that can be resolved before the next election or the one after that. This is also where the broader trade war atmosphere began making everything substantially more dangerous. Over the past year, escalating conflicts over lumber, dairy, aluminum, electric vehicles, and energy exports created a cycle in which both sides increasingly viewed each other through the lens of economic leverage rather than strategic partnership. But rivers are fundamentally different from tradable goods. There is no alternative supplier to call upon. You cannot redirect your supply chain away from a river. You can source aluminum from a different market. You cannot relocate the Columbia River to a more cooperative country. That reality gives Ottawa a form of leverage that Washington rarely discusses publicly, even as the consequences for Pacific Northwest energy reliability are enormous. Then consider the political psychology beneath all of this. Over the past year, public statements from certain officials suggested Canada possessed something akin to a massive faucet capable of redirecting water flows southward into drought-parched states like California. Hydrologists and engineers swiftly explained why that was physically impossible. Continental-scale water diversion of that magnitude would require one of the most ambitious engineering undertakings in human history. No such infrastructure exist anywhere. But those statements revealed something important about how certain policymakers were conceptualizing Canadian water resources almost as though they were naturally part of the American system, simply waiting to be unlocked through the right combination of pressure and deal-making. That mindset collided directly with the reality of the Columbia Treaty, because Canada's upstream position is not a political arrangement that can be renegotiated through tariff threats. It is a physical fact grounded in geography. This matters enormously right now because North America is entering a period in which water security and electricity demand are becoming more tightly intertwined each year. Artificial intelligence data centers are consuming staggering amounts of power. Population growth keeps pushing grids that are already stretched thin. Climate-driven drought patterns are compelling governments to fundamentally rethink long-term resource planning across the continent. In that environment, walking away from a carefully negotiated modernization deal does not read as a tough bargaining stance. It reads as the opening chapter of a far larger strategic problem. What makes the timing of this standoff even more significant is that it is unfolding while Washington is simultaneously managing another intensifying strategic confrontation on the opposite side of the world. At almost exactly the moment the Columbia River dispute was generating serious alarm among energy analysts, an American delegation arrived in Beijing for one of the most closely monitored diplomatic meetings between American and Chinese leadership in years. On the surface, the visit appeared constructive. Military honor guards, children waving flags inside the Great Hall of the People, both governments speaking publicly about trade cooperation and economic stability. But behind the cameras, the conversations reportedly grew considerably sharper, particularly around Taiwan's semiconductor supply chains and the balance of power across the Pacific. According to Chinese Foreign Ministry statements and state-run media accounts, Xi Jinping warned Trump directly that mishandling Taiwan could push the relationship toward what he described as an extremely dangerous place. Even by the typically measured standards of U.S.-China diplomacy, that language was unusually direct. Taiwan has always been the most sensitive fault line between the world's two largest economies. But the warning carried particular weight because today's strategic environment looks dramatically different from even a few years ago. China has steadily escalated military pressure around the island. The United States continues supplying defensive support under long-standing legal commitments. And both governments understand that any serious miscalculation over Taiwan would send immediate shockwaves through the global economy. The economic dimension of that risk is almost impossible to overstate. Taiwan, despite a population of roughly 23 million, sits at the absolute center of the most critical technology supply chains on the planet. It is America's fourth largest trading partner. Its semiconductor industry produces the advanced chips that power everything from smartphones to artificial intelligence platforms to the military systems that modern defense strategy depends upon. Washington is therefore managing one strategic vulnerability linked to water and hydropower in North America while confronting another tied to semiconductors and maritime security across the Pacific. In both cases, the uncomfortable conclusion is identical. The United States has found that modern economic power depends heavily on systems and supply chains it does not fully control. The Beijing summit also reportedly included substantive discussion about the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which roughly a fifth of global oil and natural gas normally flows. Ongoing regional conflict involving Iran has intensified shipping disruptions and inflation anxiety across global energy markets. American officials were pushing for Chinese cooperation because Beijing depends heavily on global trade stability and carries significant influence in Tehran. But analysts remain skeptical that China would aggressively pressure Iran, largely because Iran functions as a useful strategic counterweight to American influence in the Middle East. Step back and view all of this together, and a larger pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Across multiple regions simultaneously, Washington finds itself confronting the same core strategic dilemma. Decades of globalization created extraordinary prosperity. But that same globalization also created dependencies that are now functioning as geopolitical pressure points. In North America, it is hydropower and water management tied to Canada. In Asia, it is semiconductors and rare earth supply chains tied to Taiwan and China. In the Middle East, it is shipping lanes and energy flows tied to Hormuz and Iran. The modern global economy operates like a vast interconnected power grid where disturbances in one region ripple outward far faster than any government can politically respond. That is precisely why the Beijing summit drew as many business executives as diplomats. Elon Musk attended. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang was part of the delegation. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent discussed future trade and investment mechanisms. American negotiators pushed for large Chinese purchases of Boeing aircraft, agricultural goods, and American energy exports. Meanwhile, Beijing pressed Washington to relax restrictions on advanced semiconductor technology and chip-making equipment. Even reports that the United States had approved roughly 10 Chinese firms to purchase NVIDIA's powerful H20 AI chips generated enormous headlines because artificial intelligence infrastructure has become one of the defining strategic battlegrounds between the two countries. The economic and military implications of who controls next-generation AI computing power are still being written in real time. And this is precisely why the Columbia River situation feels larger than a regional treaty dispute. The same world that once rewarded deep economic integration is now exposing how dangerously vulnerable major powers become when essential systems depend on external cooperation they can no longer guarantee. The Pacific Northwest became one of the cheapest electricity regions in the developed world because the United States and Canada spent 60 years carefully co-managing a shared river system. Taiwan became the hub of global technology because companies optimized semiconductor production for efficiency rather than geopolitical resilience. China became embedded in global manufacturing because corporations chased scale and market access rather than strategic independence. None of these systems were designed for a world in which trade wars, military tensions, sanctions regimes, and resource nationalism would all escalate simultaneously. That is precisely the world we inhabit today. Imagine confronting electricity instability across the Pacific Northwest at the same moment you are navigating semiconductor disruptions linked to Taiwan and shipping disruptions tied to the Strait of Hormuz. Suddenly, issues that once appeared isolated and manageable begin forming a single, much larger picture about infrastructure securities, supply chain resilience, and the new nature of geopolitical leverage in the 21st century. Governments are starting to understand that the most potent form of leverage today may not be military force alone, but rather control over the invisible systems other nations quietly depend on every single day without ever stopping to think about them. And perhaps the most important insight about all of these tensions is that none of them appeared suddenly. The Columbia River Treaty required 16 years to negotiate following the Vanport catastrophe. Taiwan's unresolved political status has persisted for generations. The U.S.-China trade relationship evolved over decades of globalization. The Strait of Hormuz has been strategically vital since modern energy markets first emerged. These are long-accumulating structural pressures now colliding within an increasingly unstable global environment, one in which every government is racing to secure leverage before the next crisis materializes. That is why moments like a stalled river treaty or a sharp diplomatic warning in Beijing carry weight far beyond a single news cycle. They reveal how swiftly the assumptions holding the modern world together are shifting beneath the surface. Right now, Canadian officials still control the upstream reservoirs. Beijing still treats Taiwan as a non-negotiable red line. Washington still wants stable trade flows, secure energy supplies, and reliable access to critical technology. But every single one of those objectives now depends on cooperation between governments that increasingly distrust one another while remaining economically bound together in ways none of them can easily escape. That contradiction may define global politics for the coming decade more than any election or speech ever could. Most people only notice these systems when they begin to break down. Most Americans never thought to ask where Pacific Northwest hydroelectric power originated until treaty negotiations unraveled. Most consumers never considered semiconductor manufacturing until chip shortages paralyzed industries worldwide. Most people never paid attention to the Strait of Hormuz until oil prices began reacting violently to military tension. Yet these invisible systems silently shape modern life every single day. And when governments begin weaponizing them against each other, the economic damage spreads far beyond anything a political campaign can contain. So here is the real question. Are today's leaders still capable of rebuilding long-term cooperation before these pressure points spiral into something none of us can fully foresee? Because rivers cannot be negotiated with indefinitely. Supply chains cannot absorb unlimited geopolitical stress. And history demonstrates clearly that once countries begin viewing strategic interdependence as a threat rather than a foundation, the global economy enters territory that history has rarely navigated successfully, with Canada holding genuine leverage over critical hydropower, China drawing firm lines around Taiwan, and Washington attempting to manage simultaneous crises across multiple continents. The world is measurably less stable than it was even 2 years ago. These are not separate stories. They are the same story about a global system built on trust and cooperation that is now being tested by precisely the conditions it was never designed to survive. If you have read this far, you already understand more about how the modern world actually functions than most people watching the evening news tonight. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Washington will quietly revive the Columbia River deal before the energy stakes escalate further? Or will this continue until the entire power relationship in North America shifts permanently? And on China, did the Beijing summit genuinely lower the temperature, or was it simply a pause before the next confrontation? The next development in this story may arrive sooner than any of us expect. Hit subscribe so you do not miss it when it does.